Everyone, please take your seats. We're about to begin. Thank you so much. I'm Katie Glenn Bass. I'm the research director at the Knight Institute. We are about to begin our second panel, which is moderated by Laura Edelson. Laura is a computer scientist who co-leads the Cybersecurity for Democracy project at New York University's Tandon School of Engineering. Laura, thank you so much.
Hey, folks. Just before the people come into the room, when it's just the five of us in this completely empty auditorium, I thought we should have a little pre-panel chat, because I don't know about you, but I found the first panel super depressing, because there is no hope in the universe, which for us engineers and computer scientists, I sort of heard as there is no justice, there is just us. And, we also heard about how the algorithm is a myth, which is going to pose a problem for those of us who want to audit it. So, a little bit more in the mic? Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, so, because I know, Deb, you're really far away, so if you're going to hear me, I better talk into this mic. So, anyway, I kind of just wanted to start by saying that I'm glad we are going to bring some concrete structure to talking about how we are going to turn this myth into a reality that we can take apart and lay down all the pieces on a nice black cloth and examine them closely. So, oh, wait. Oh, you're all here. Okay. Oh. Well, goodness, don't I feel embarrassed. Okay. Well, since you're here, just a quick introduction then for our first panelist on this panel about auditing. Let me introduce Fabian Baumann. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, where he works on computational social science. His current focus is on how culture evolves in a collaborative process, influenced by both social interaction and intelligent algorithms. And so I think I'm going to do introductions one at a time, because I think folks' background is quite relevant to their talk. So with that, Fabian, do you want to take it away for us?
Yes, sure. Okay. Yeah, thank you for that nice introduction. And following Laura's motivational internal speech, I would like to draw your attention to some empirical approaches that we can use to investigate the impact of algorithms on digital culture. And to do that, I would like to start out and emphasize how collaborative culture is. So in everything that we engage and every type of culture that humans produce, there are collaborative processes involved, and these emergent phenomena, they are usually summarized in a term which we call cultural evolution. And okay, I'm realizing it's not very sharp, but I hope you can see everything. It involves learning and also the ability of us to collectively solve problems. So when we think of science, for instance, we would usually collaborate on projects, right? And even if we don't, if we sit alone in our lab, then we would build on the knowledge of others to progress science. And this also holds true in other cultural domains, like in the arts. Let's take the example of music, where you can be Bob Dylan and you can write a song, but then you would maybe perform it in a band, and then the song might get improved and it might spread in the population and become culture. So when we go from Newton's laws to Einstein's general relativity, or when we go from classical music to electronic music, countless learning events are involved. People exchange information, they choose some type of some piece of information over another, they refine cultural items that they improve over time, and then ultimately a new scientific theory, just as an example, or a new song, a movie can then become part of our cultural repertoire. And crucially, I think what an individual can contribute in this process, in this cycle of, let's say, innovation or cultural evolution, strongly depends on the content and information that they can get from their surrounding. Nowadays, this is strongly impacted by algorithms. So we're not solely dependent on our social circle to get information. It's not only our friends in school or university or wherever where we get a new song or a movie recommendation or they tell us something about the news. It's rather these large online platforms that sort of determine what we see. There's a lot of production of new cultural content on platforms like Spotify, YouTube videos, or even in science. Like when I search for research, I'm sometimes asking my colleagues, but I also realize that asking Google Scholar is sometimes even a better idea. So these large platforms, they produce a lot, but they also help us to pre-select content and navigate this vast space of possibilities, essentially. But as these algorithms are so ubiquitous, they are everywhere, and we interact with them virtually every time we open up our browser, it's very hard to study the actual impact. And we have learned before, it's also hard to define a baseline. So how can we do that? And there are different ways. And one of them, it's maybe the most straightforward one. We can take data sets of cultural items. We have them available, and they are really big nowadays, and we can analyze them. And for instance, here in this, in a previous study, the authors, they studied data sets from Spotify and iTunes, where listening habits of users were recorded to uncover like cultural pattern in there. And what they, for instance, realized, or you can see that in this plot, that the sort of cultural diversity or the song variety that people listen to worldwide goes up after 2017, roughly. So these data sets, they are really nice to uncover a cultural pattern, but it's really hard to say something about what caused this mechanism, like why is this the case? And so, yeah, so we can uncover this pattern, but we cannot really say what triggered it. And in the context of algorithms, we would argue that, yeah, probably it's a lot about personalization. So everyone gets their own music recommendation, and this is the reason why everyone hears something else and the diversity goes up. But to explain what's the actual mechanism, and my slides, they are really not looking as they should, but we can make it. So we can do lab experiments to get more control. So we invite human participants to the lab, and we can, for instance, put them in different conditions. So we can study precisely what would be the effect of one algorithm versus another, or versus a neutral baseline if we're able to do or to construct one. And then varying the algorithm, we can then see what comes out of that, and we can then make a causal claim, a causal conclusion, what's the role of the algorithm, which is then, which is different from the observational data. But the disadvantage in lab experiments is often that it's not very realistic. So we have the control, but we're dealing with artificial cultural artifacts. So the posts that people engage with or the music songs that they artificially like, they're not the ones that would naturally emerge in their social environment. So while we have the control and while we may make causal claims about what triggers some event or some pattern, it's rather unrealistic. But fortunately, there's some sort of middle ground where we can take this lab idea to the field. And with field, I mean a realistic social media environment where we are not inviting participants to the lab, but we're recruiting them on a platform. And fortunately, as we also heard before, more and more platforms give users the opportunity to opt out of personalization or algorithmic curation. And then in such a field experiment, you can make use of this. So first of all, you have the realistic environment, and people also get a realistic social feedback. So when they do something in a field experiment, they would know that their friends in the real life, they would notice this. So the behavior that they would show there is much more reliable than in the lab setting. And then, as an experimenter, you can then assign different participants to different algorithms that they can choose. And then, in the same way as you would do in the lab, you can observe what comes out. So, and with this observation in a broad cultural sense, I mean, what do they see, which type of content, what is the content distribution, which type of topics, how do they engage with the content? Is it rather passive action like retweeting something or liking, or do they produce new stuff? All these types of things that might be relevant for the evolution of culture, you can study this in a sort of realistic environment while retaining control over the algorithm that's actually in use. So to conclude, we have different options when we want to look at the impact of algorithms on cultural change. On the one hand, we can look at realistic data sets where we can uncover emergent phenomena, but we have the problem that we don't really know what's triggering them. And then on the other extreme, we have controlled lab experiments where we have controlled what happens, but what we lack is a little bit of realism because cultural items might be artificial or the social context is missing. And in between, there's this nice space where you have these field experiments that I talked about in my last slide, where you get a good trade-off of both worlds. So you have some control because more and more platforms give you the opportunity to change the algorithm, and maybe in the future they have to, which is good. But you can observe them, but it's also a realistic environment. So I think these field experiments, they are a good opportunity to study the evolution of culture in the future under the impression of algorithmic curation. And with this, I am looking forward to our discussion, and thank you for your attention.
So just because I have so many questions for all of you, and mostly I want you to talk to each other, we're going to go straight into the next talk. So Dr. William Brady is an assistant professor of management and organization at Northwestern University. His research examines the dynamics of emotion at the social network level and their consequences for group behavior. So that's going to be interesting.
All right, so we're all here for a symposium about algorithmic amplification. And as the resident social psychologist here today, I want to tell you that algorithmic amplification is not simply about algorithms. It's about our psychology, our tendency and our capacity to socially learn from others, and how those two mechanisms interact with each other. I think that can shed a lot of light on some of the things that brought us here today, probably, things like the spread of misinformation, why certain contexts like politics can be so toxic and polarizing on social media platforms. And I want to explain all of this through the concept that I'm introducing called algorithm-mediated social learning. And the way that we can unpack this, I think it starts from a very simple observation, which is that we are all prodigious social learners. And so what I mean by that is we have this capacity to learn from others directly. We learn through trial and error, through reinforcement. We also learn through observation. And it's thought that our capacity for social learning is actually the building block of culture, how we learn not just from people right in front of us, but also from past things that we've learned so that we can accumulate culture over time and improve society. Well, it turns out that the way that we learn from others actually is biased. And it's biased not in necessarily a bad way. It's biased in a way that tends to be functional. So what I mean by that, first, let me talk about a couple of these biases. So we know from a lot of research in cultural evolution and psychology that we have biases to disproportionately learn from certain types of models, like prestigious and in-group members. We also learn from certain types of content, like emotion and moral content. And the reason why these are actually functional is because they help us learn more efficiently. For example, when we learn from prestigious others, actually prestige tends to be a signal that someone has been successful. And so it's more efficient to learn from others who are successful than those who are not. In-group members tend to be people who are most relevant to our social and physical world, so it makes sense that we would learn from those people disproportionately. And then when it comes to things like emotional information and moral information, well, you can see how this is the type of information, although it tends to be relatively rare, it helps us navigate the social world. If we know what our social group thinks of as moral, then we can navigate not getting punished, and we can also call out others who are not cooperating. So altogether, these biases are thought to lead to adaptive behaviors that sustain things like collective problem solving and cooperation. Now let's compare these functions of our social learning with the function of content algorithms, or in other words, how they're designed. So we know that content algorithms, generally speaking, those that are employed by social media platforms, are capturing our attention and maximizing engagement. That's one of the things that they're optimizing for. Now, you can already see how these two functions might actually lead to some difficulties or some conflicts. And if you've been paying attention, you might actually guess, what are the things that tend to draw in our attention and sustain engagement? Well, it turns out that this would be the things that we are biased to socially learn from and to attend to. And now there's been a lot of research coming out of psychology and other fields, including some of my groups, that we attend and we engage with content online that follows this pattern of the things we're biased to learn from. So prestigious, in-group, moralized, and emotional content. So I summarize this as prime information. This is the things that we are biased to learn from and the things that algorithms amplify, not because they were designed that way, but it's the side effect of their other design, which is to sustain attention and engagement. So this leads us to a model of algorithm-mediated social learning. It's a simplified model, but I think it'll at least fit our purposes for today. So again, I described how we have these biases to attend and learn from prime information. The content algorithms are amplifying that because of their design, but the thing that's very interesting is what emerges when both of these forces are interacting. And so the interesting thing about our social learning and how it interacts with content algorithm amplification is the fact that not only are algorithms amplifying prime information, but we are starting to learn to produce more of that ourselves in certain contexts because of our social learning capacity. So algorithms are not just amplifying content, they're amplifying content that is produced by social others. And so, for example, when we see more of a certain type of content in our newsfeed, it's hard for us not to engage in observational learning to see what is appropriate for us to produce in our social network. Another part of algorithms is that they're actually affecting who it is that sees the content that we post ourselves. And so they're feeding it to people who are more likely to like and engage with our post. That can actually create reinforcement learning where we're learning through trial and error to produce more prime content over time. And so these forces are interacting to produce algorithm-mediated social learning, and it actually can create, in certain contexts, again, there actually are some breaks on this feedback loop that I'm proposing, which we can talk about in the panel, but for especially certain contexts like politics, is leading to an oversaturation of prime content. And whereas in general, prime content and our attraction toward it actually can promote adaptive behaviors that help things like cooperation and collective problem solving, when they actually, that's in the case when they're relatively rare, but when they start to oversaturate the environment, it flips that function. And you end up getting things like conflict and the spread of misinformation because, for example, misinformation rises on the coattails of prime information. We have data suggesting that misinformation tends to evoke outrage. That's one of the ways it draws attention and leads to engagement. So I think there's a lot to discuss about, well, if these processes are going on, what are some of the things that can put a brake on it? What are some interventions? And we're going to talk about this, I think, in our panel. But one of the things that I think is important is to think about how to potentially alter algorithms so that they have a goal of producing more efficient social learning. So it's not just about, do we need to ban certain content? Do we need to get rid of others? You really have to consider how our social learning is interacting with the content and the algorithms. I think it's really a matter of psychology and technology interacting. So I'm excited to talk more about potential solutions and things like that, but that's all I have so far. And I want to thank my collaborators who helped both test these ideas empirically and also develop this concept. Thanks so much.
Thanks, William. Next up, we have Smitha Milli, who is a postdoctoral associate at Cornell Tech. They received their BS and PhD in electrical engineering and computer science from UC Berkeley.
Cool, thanks. So a lot of the talks, thank you, thus far we've been talking about amplification in the abstract. In my talk, I kind of want to focus on a deep dive and talk about a specific study we ran trying to actually measure effects of Twitter's ranking algorithm from the outside without internal access. Cool. So without further ado, we have a lot of hypotheses about what social media is doing. Is it making us more polarized, more depressed, more angry, et cetera? But it's really hard to measure the effects of this algorithm, not only for many of the nuances that have already been discussed, but simply because usually, if you're outside of the platform, you don't have access to turning the algorithm on or off, or any kinds of baselines at all. Luckily for us, Twitter does have a different kind of feed that you can look at besides algorithmic, which is the reverse chronological baseline feed. And so we leveraged this reverse chronological feed, and of course, I'll talk about some of the nuances that come with using this kind of feed later, to run a randomized experiment measuring effects of Twitter's algorithm from the outside. So very briefly, I'll just describe our study design. So we recruited a large group of Twitter users on Cloud Research Connect, which is a crowd-working platform, kind of like Mechanical Turk, if you've heard of it. And then simultaneously, for each participant, we grabbed both the top 10 tweets in their personalized timeline and the top 10 tweets in their chronological timeline. So we have this counterfactual of what are the tweets they would see if they were just seeing tweets from people they follow, and what are the tweets that they see under the algorithm. And then, and we collected about 1,700 of these pairs of timelines. So then after that, we surveyed these users about the tweets from both timelines in a randomized order. So we can start to estimate the effects of the algorithm by comparing the outcomes, their survey responses to tweets from the personalized timeline to those from the chronological timeline. So this allows us to get actual causal estimates of what the effect of the algorithm is on these self-report measures. And all of these outcomes, statistical analyses, hypotheses, these are all pre-registered, meaning we pre-registered all of these before any data collection happened. So what are the outcomes that we actually measured? I'm actually just going to show you sort of what it looks like for survey participants. So they would see a tweet, one of the tweets that we collected, either from their chronological or personalized timeline. So this is one from California Senator Scott Wiener. And then the first category of things we asked them about were emotions. So for example, what is Senator Scott Wiener feeling in their tweet on 4 dimensions? Angry, sad, anxious, happy. Similarly, we asked about how this tweet makes the reader feel. And then the next category of outcomes that we looked at were political. So we asked them whether a tweet was about a political or social issue. And if it was, we asked them to rate the partisanship on a left-right ideology scale. After that, we asked them how their perception of people or groups on the left changed after reading the tweet, and people or groups on the right changed after reading the tweet. So if the person labeled the tweet as, say, being right-leaning, we also asked them is the author of this tweet expressing anger, hostility, frustration towards a person or group on the left. So this is capturing outgroup animosity. Oh, and I should mention that for this in-group and out-group, for the left and right perception, we also asked users themselves how they leaned on a left-right scale, so we can get at their change in in-group and out-group perception after reading tweets as well. Okay, so what were our key takeaways? Well, the first is that the algorithm does indeed, as many have hypothesized, amplify emotional content, especially anger and outgroup animosity, many of the things that Billy was just talking about. The second is that, and I should say that this happens both on the author and reader side, and when we look at political tweets in particular, by far the dominant emotion amplified is anger. We also find that after reading tweets from the algorithm, users have a better perception of their in-group and a worse perception of their out-group, so potentially contributing to effective polarization. Of course, we don't measure people's long-term belief changes here. It's just sort of suggestive in that direction. Interestingly, we find this effect without finding any kind of filter bubble effect. You see basically the same proportion of outgroup content on both personalized and chronological. And in fact, under the algorithm, you see slightly more outgroup content. So what this suggests is not that this kind of effect is happening because the algorithm is sorting people into filter bubbles, but rather because the algorithm is amplifying particularly divisive content, like our finding that it's amplifying outgroup animosity, might suggest. And then lastly, I think very interestingly, we also, I think I skipped over a slide about explicit preference or something, but we also asked people explicitly what they prefer. Do you want to see would you want to see this tweet in your timeline? And we find that for tweets overall, people do prefer the algorithm-selected tweets, but for political tweets in particular, they don't. So this is super interesting to us because the algorithm is always justified by, we're showing you content you want, but under what kinds of preferences? And perhaps for certain types of content, like political content, what your revealed preferences are, what you do, the biases that you might have that make you attend more to certain types of content don't align with your more reflective stated preferences. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the interpretation and some nuances of this study. So we made a trade-off in our study, deciding to try to make this really rigorous and get rigorous causal effects. The only differences between our two conditions are the tweets ranked by the algorithm or chronological timeline? So these are short-term effects that are precise, but obviously the algorithm exists in a feedback loop. So as a lot of the discussion in the first panel touched on, the algorithm, the personalized timeline, also affects your chronological timeline. You see users that you might want to follow recommended on your algorithmic timeline, that obviously then affects your chronological timeline. And many of these, the social learning aspects that Billy just mentioned, so if the algorithm is amplifying outgroup animosity, you may learn to produce more outgroup animosity, either by observational learning, the norms change, reinforcement learning, you're getting more likes on stuff that have outgroup animosity, or you're specifically trying to game the algorithm. You're a news outlet or you're a political party and you're running your own A/B tests, trying to figure out what is going to get the highest engagement. And so I think it's important to note sort of that these results don't capture those long-term effects, but I think they give you suggestive evidence of what the direction of this feedback loop is. Like, we know that people tend to produce more of what the algorithm incentivizes, so we actually expect that the effects from our study are in a sense being underestimated as the long-term effects of the algorithm take into account this kind of positive feedback loop. Cool, I'll stop there. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Smitha, I have so many questions, but we will save them for the end.
Yeah.
Last and certainly not least, we have Deb Raji. Deb is a PhD student at UC Berkeley, and she's also a Mozilla Fellow. She studies questions of algorithmic auditing and evaluation. And can I just say, as one of the computer scientists working in this space who I personally whose work I've found so influential over the last several years.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, it's quite narrow back there.
I was going to say, we're quite close to the edge. Yeah. Like you can't see, but there's a huge wall right by the chairs. And thank you so much, Laura. That was very kind. Hi, I'm Deb. As Laura mentioned, a lot of my work is on algorithm auditing. Actually, this particular project that I'm going to present is quite out of left field in terms of it's very different from what I typically work on. Typically, I'm looking at risk assessments and automated decision systems. That's been a lot of the focus of the audits I've participated in the past. And a lot of my work with Mozilla has been on infrastructure for algorithm auditing. So thinking about tools that auditors need in order to make the audit process feasible. But this project actually came from a completely different angle or a completely different kind of out of left field, where I had an incredible sort of separate, interesting conversations with both Irene and Fernando, who were gracious enough to sort of mentor me through this process and through this project. But instead of looking at, for example, typically, you have these online platforms that as we've been discussing, where there's content distributed through the platform, and some of that content is made more visible than others. So you have different ways in which that ecosystem of the platform prioritizes content over others. Okay, great, you can see it. I was worried it was too high. And typically what we do when we are trying to figure out, what's responsible for the promotion of one piece of content versus another piece of content is that we audit the algorithm, because the algorithm is quite influential in terms of showing people one piece of content versus another. However, there's another factor. I think it was mentioned in the first panel that, the platform is an ecosystem that involves much more than the algorithm. I know that was slightly depressing for you, Laura. But there's stakeholders interacting on this platform, and they have different user actions and behaviors that are logged in data that we can obtain through the algorithm. And when I say users, I don't just mean consumers of content that's distributed on the platform, but also advertisers, producers. You can think about all the different roles that users on these platforms play and how they can interact with each other or make independent decisions from the algorithm that could influence what is seen and what is not seen on this platform. And so one question that you could ask, just looking at this lens of auditing user behavior and actions and not just auditing the algorithm, is how do content producers' actions, I can't see it from back here, sorry, I have to turn. How do content producers' actions impact content visibility and trends? So content producers are a really important subset of the users on a platform. What do they do, and how can we track their behavior in ways that influence the visibility of certain posts? So one way to think about this is that we can kind of consider or model the online platform as a two-sided market. So if anyone here has taken Econ 101, you probably know that a two-sided market is one in which there's a certain number of buyers and they're kind of purchasing goods and services from another separate group of sellers. And an ideal market is one in which you have enough sellers giving you options, and as buyers you have several options to choose from. And that's sort of a condition known as perfect competition. And in this case, or with this analogy, the producers of content, cultural artifacts, those are the sellers in this case. They're trying to show you things and increase your attention towards the products or the items that they have produced. On the other side, you have sort of the buyers, which are the consumers of this content. And there's been a lot of work, you might have heard the term attention economy, you might have heard of cultural artifacts or cultural symbols from sociology. This notion of modeling the online platform as a market isn't necessarily very new. And similarly, because the platform is sort of modeled as a market or can be modeled as a market, the features of that platform influence the dynamics of that market. So, depending on the rate at which people produce this content and adapt to each other's behaviors, depending on the monetization scheme of the platform, Netflix versus YouTube versus TikTok, the nature of that market and the dynamics of that market can change in response to these different features of the platform. So the phenomenon that we were very interested in particular are instances where you have a small group of sellers, or in this case, content producers, that communicate with each other and negotiate to give themselves an unfair advantage in this marketplace. In this case, that would mean a bunch of content creators sort of working together without disclosing that collaboration to the audience of the audience on the platform, and using that as a way to sort of unfairly promote their work compared to their peers. And this is a term that we call collusion. So this idea of a small kind of controlling stake of firms, or in this case, content producers, is one in which they are colluding to kind of give themselves an advantage over other producers in that market. And the way that it manifests, or the way that we suspect or theorize that it manifests in online platforms, is indirectly, sometimes through these like creator forums where they share tips and tricks to increase the visibility of their work to each other, and anyone that's sort of plugged into that forum has access to that information. There's also this notion of folk theories that's become increasingly popular, where creators will share with each other sort of different tricks and tips on how to increase their visibility, but not necessarily disclose that always explicitly to the audience that they're leveraging these tricks and tips. And then more direct collusion is also possible, where on certain platforms, especially user-generated platforms versus subscription-based distribution channels, those producers can directly communicate with each other. You know, they can like each other's stuff, comment on each other, subscribe, maybe even message each other, and coordinate around increasing the mutual visibility of their work. So, you know, why does this matter? Why is this interesting? How do we measure this? I can't go into the details of it. We're still exploring it. This is work that's in progress. But, you know, one of the challenges, or one of the reasons why this matters, is because in the market case, when you have a small group of firms that are working together to give themselves an unfair advantage in the market, then it turns very easily into an oligopoly, which is this notion of that small number of firms really dominating the market, meaning that most of the people that are looking to buy, let's say, a shoe, only have a small number of firms to choose from, because those small number of firms have sort of given themselves a collective advantage. And you know, one like very kind of commonly known threat of this would be like price fixing. So because that small number of firm controls the market, similar to a monopoly, except with a larger number of folks, you can sort of set the price in any way. And so in this case, you might imagine like a situation of attention fixing, where if you have a small number of dominant creators on a particular platform, those creators are pretty much at liberty to sort of dictate the attention of that audience in whatever way they choose, and sort of have undue influence over that sort of attention economy or attention marketplace. And so the way that this has sort of historically, or that we've found that has historically been analyzed or measured, has been through the analysis of sort of moments of concentration or competition along the most viewed content on these different platforms. So for example, you know, looking at the top content on YouTube or TikTok, you might see that the number of those responsible for generating that content might decrease. So, you know, versus 100 creators responsible for the 100 most popular videos, you might have like 50 creators responsible for the 100 most popular videos. And we suspect that that also leads to a sort of decrease in the diversity of the content being produced and the type of content being propagated. And like I mentioned, you know, this has been observed historically in sort of the music industry. So we're eager to test it out on, you know, different online platforms and see how these platform design decisions around, you know, platform characteristics affect the dynamics of this market. So that's YouTube, TikTok, and Netflix, hopefully. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. So just to remind everyone again, if you would like to submit questions, either for folks here in the room or for folks online, just follow that QR code, submit that question. It'll show up on this iPad that Katie has very kindly put in front of me. But I'm not going to look at that yet because I have questions. And moderator's privilege, I get to go first. So I think, you know, one of the first questions that comes to my mind, something that's really been something I think about a lot in general, but something that's really been preying on my mind as I've been listening to you all speak, is that, you know, fundamentally what we are dealing with here are socio-technological systems. I'm a computer scientist. I have read 100% of the computer science papers that have more than like 2 citations in the discipline of computer science, because like I am working in this field of auditing myself, and it's not like there's just not that much literature yet. So I've read 100% of those papers. I know that I have, but I also know that's why I'm like super familiar with Deb's work. I'm familiar with Smitha's work. I know I'm much less familiar, Fabian and William, with your work, because you're just in a you're in like a very adjacent field, but you're not in computer science. And I'm very worried about this because, as I said, these are socio-technological systems. And I feel like when I am in a room full of lawyers, they are having one kind of conversation about these systems. And when I'm in a room with computational social scientists, they're having a different conversation. And we computer scientists are having a third totally different conversation. But we're all talking about the same thing, but we're not always talking to each other. Yeah. And I'm just really worried about how we're going to come to solutions when we are sort of all going down our own rabbit hole. So I'm curious how you think about this problem. I know we're all trying to work in an interdisciplinary way that our fields don't always reward, but maybe we can just sort of run down the panel and talk about, what you think about this problem. Maybe I'm totally wrong, and maybe what you think we can do to address it. You wanna go first?
Yeah, I can go first. But I think I'm not that pessimistic actually, because I'm a physicist. Like you are. What did you study? Psychologist. We can go down the line.
Yeah.
Identities.
No, go ahead.
Computer science.
Yeah, computer science.
Okay, so more computer scientists on this table, but I still think, from my experience working in physics, I perceive this field very interdisciplinary, and we came, together here. So I'm not that pessimistic. Maybe that's my take on that. But more conferences.
You have to keep running these events.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm sort of in between as someone who's, worked in cross-disciplinary groups for now maybe 8 years. I think there's a lot of promise, and I think the field of computational social science is a great example of really trying to bring in different academic disciplines and creating better insights from combining all of those. But of course, there's a lot of challenges that come with that. So anyone who's done cross-disciplinary work, that sometimes it takes, months before you can even understand each other in terms of how you're approaching something theoretically or methodologically. So I just think, we're headed in the right direction. So I share that optimism, but I do think there are a lot of challenges, and certainly conferences like this help that. I'm also, on one hand, I'm pleased to see that industry is also hiring a lot of social scientists now, although they're leaving the field, so there's pros and cons to that. But in general, I think, having academic industry collaborations and having those collaborations really be centered around different fields is fundamentally important, because I think you're right. There's computer scientists who are making decisions where if you're a psychologist, you're like, well, that was predictable, this problem. But then, of course, the opposite happens, So I think I share both optimism and concern, but I think there's good hope moving forward.
Yeah, I'm pretty optimistic. More symposiums like this. I think this has actually been a great idea, because there are so many people working on amplification from different disciplines. I feel like people studying this do recognize how interdisciplinary it is. Like, I found that review by Jonathan Haidt and others, the Lit Review, to be pretty informative when I was starting to look through some of the literature. And so the fact that people are doing cross-cutting literature reviews and stuff like that is very helpful.
I think I'm pessimistic but hopeful, if that makes sense. Like, I think I had mentioned sort of putting on my Mozilla hat. Like, I'm working on this project called the Open Source Audit Tooling Project, where we're trying to sort of catalog and taxonomize the different resources that people leverage as part of their audit work. And that has been an interesting experience, just because it's revealed how segmented the community is. There are, regulators that do audits. There are people in law firms that do audits. There are a lot of data journalists doing incredible audit work. And so, even though this symposium was very diverse, I don't know if we have many journalists, for example. So there's always going to be one group that doesn't quite make it, but I just feel like, oh, okay, sorry, there's a journalist in the audience, I apologize. You're right. Yeah, right. Yeah, I apologize. You're all here. I'm sure. And this is a great symposium. I also think this is a great, like others have said, this is a great, interesting space too, because you also see the tensions in terms of how people view certain things as well. Even the definition of amplification is so different. But something that I found really interesting was because there were all these different groups and the definitions of how to do an audit, and the methodology was so different, it was really hard to help each other. So journalists, for example, had developed really good, there was Algorithm Tips is a tool that was developed by Nick Yakopoulos and a student at Northwestern. And, it's a really helpful tool for journalists to sort of identify different algorithmic deployments in government. And a lot of academics that sort of do this work would have found so much utility in that, but had no idea that it existed. And so there was so much siloing in terms of the resources being developed by these different communities. And it was just really interesting and insightful for me. And then I think the other dimension of it was even when we did inform, let's say, a bunch of journalists about a tool that policymakers or computer scientists were using, the tools were completely illegible to each other. So this idea of sort of like a multidisciplinary community, or multidisciplinary users of particular tools became a really interesting challenge of that work. So I do think it is like particularly difficult to do this work because it is at the intersection of so many things. But I agree with you, Laura, that the problem is inherently socio-technical. Like you won't be able to achieve it with only a computer scientist perspective or only a legal perspective. Like it does require sitting together long enough to understand each other. So I hope, that's why I'm saying I'm hopeful that things will get better and improve, because I really don't think that there is a solution independent of this collaboration across disciplines.
Yeah, I would state for the record that I'm also quite hopeful on this. I think, again, speaking as a computer scientist, we've been and especially, I'm very specifically, I'm a cybersecurity researcher. I think about this problem as a cybersecurity problem, and the cybersecurity community has been on this long journey over particularly the last 10 to 15 years of there are humans at the end of these computers, and those humans introduce other variables that we have to consider if we want to build safe and robust systems, and so but I think that said. I spend a lot of time, trying to read into other disciplines, but it is, because it is the only way to solve a problem. Mm-hmm. So I really feel that. I'm getting a lot of really great, and I love this, extremely specific questions in the Q&A, and I will get to them, but I think, something again that I'm thinking a lot about listening to all of our talks is that there are so many, these systems are very complex, and a lot of us are working on different aspects of them. So I was wondering if maybe we could also sort of just go down the line. I mean, I'm very curious, what do you think is the most important research question that you are thinking about and that you think is tractable and that you are going to sort of get your hands around in the next, call it 5-year time horizon? What do you think we have to do, and what do you think we are going to do?
Should I start? So I think in some domains, for instance in the political domain, when it comes to algorithms, it's sort of straightforward to say what's important, because we can all agree that, misinformation is bad, or too much polarization and isolation of different, societal groups is bad, and I think that's we can agree on that. But when it comes to culture in more general terms, I think it's a bit harder, and I guess that's not a very satisfying answer to your question.
You can't fool me. You just don't want to give other people your research ideas.
No, but I think it's hard to tell what's important, and it's hard to judge what is good and bad. But there are certainly interesting, dynamical aspects that one can have a look at. As an individual, for instance, I would say it's like a platform, whatever online platform it is, if it's about music, videos, or other cultural stuff, I would say I would like to have the possibility to explore new things. Like sort of this trade-off between exploitation, what I'm good at, and exploring new stuff. I think we see this everywhere, like in learning algorithms. We see it in neuroscience, probably.
So just to clarify, are you saying that you want to, that this is this sort of how different platforms for cultural content, how they make that trade-off? Like, are you saying like you want to understand that in terms of how algorithms are designed?
Yes, but also maybe as a normative goal that I would think that like there's an ideal balance between exploitation and exploration, and this connects to, I don't know, higher level goals such as innovation. So to have a new idea or to create, I don't know, creativity in a space, we all need to have novel inputs, but we also should be able to leverage stuff that we're familiar with. So like kind of quantifying such a trade-off, for instance, would be a nice like outcome measure, and like would be cool to dig into more.
That does sound cool.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the most interesting questions for social scientists right now in this space is figuring out, well, what are some of the downstream behavioral consequences of the things that we've been documenting, like in my talk and Smitha's talk. So for example, one of the things that I've looked at recently is like when our feeds tend to be saturated with prime content, how does that affect our social judgments of group norms and effective polarization, things like this. And I think the reason why all this is important is because when we're thinking about interventions, we have to figure out, well, what are we trying to actually fix in terms of the behavioral outcomes? And that sometimes is unclear because there's not enough research on that. And then the second thing I would say, which is interesting from my perspective, I'll actually depart a little bit from what Fabian was saying. I think in some cases, like misinformation, it's a very clear goal. We should be trying to reduce that because we don't want false information on platforms. But when it comes to things like polarization, outrage, et cetera, I think there's actually no agreed upon solution because sometimes polarizing content or outrage actually serve important social functions. And so actually I think what we need to do is come together as a broader scientific and even like in the humanities to figure out, you know, if we're trying to regulate platforms, what exactly should that even look like? I think that's still completely undefined, especially when it comes to a lot of these social issues that we care about a lot.
I had a bunch of ideas during the symposium. So yeah, one is kind of along the lines.
It's working.
Yes, right. Bringing all these people together. One is
Arvind should do this every year. No, I'm joking.
Not. Kind of along the lines of what Billy was saying, I am interested in how we can start to measure feedback loops more. So I think we haven't really gotten that much great evidence just on like what are the algorithms doing right now. But as we get more evidence of that, then you can start to like expand out and think about what the long-term effects are. Jonathan, Luke, and Priya had a new post in their Understanding How Platform Recommenders Work blog post series, which is great, about feedback loops recently. And I like sort of the idea of trying to break the feedback loop into different components, study those components separately in more tractable components, and then you can start to understand what the overall feedback loop is. Like if we know that the algorithm increases outgroup animosity, and then because of all these ways people learn, people produce more of that content, we see a feedback loop there, or then how does that actually change people's beliefs and so on. Apart from the measurement side, I'm obviously interested in interventions, and I come at it more from the view of algorithmic interventions. So I do think that a lot of the problems that we see arise from the objective function that these recommender systems are optimizing for, which is primarily engagement-based. So for example, like in our study where we found that people don't prefer the algorithm-selected tweets for political content. Presumably, those tweets are still the ones that are getting more engagement, and that's why they're being recommended by the algorithm. So I have been interested in a while for how are there ways that we can leverage more explicit feedback from users to balance that out. I'm not saying that stated preferences, like what the user says is always what's right, but right now we're at an extreme of only really optimizing for behaviorism, and we can do something in the middle. So I interned on the Twitter ML ethics team a couple of times as a PhD student, and there one of the things I did was, with Luca, who's here, try to use an explicit signal, like show me less of this, or I'm not interested in this, to figure out how much we should learn from other implicit behaviors like click, retweet, etc. So one thing I'm working on is like trying to leverage those explicit signals that are strong but sparse in more efficient ways. I also think I was inspired by, of course, the bridging-based ranking conversations we've had here, which we'll hear more about later. But if we are trying to design systems that bridge instead, how do we design? I think there are ways that we can maybe like co-opt objective metrics we have now to produce more bridging or conversations. So for example, like if you are optimizing for replies, that maybe just leads to angry conversations. But if one of the behaviors in your objective are replies that are then liked by the author, that's different. And I think people don't really have a good sense of how you should tune the weights on these different behaviors in the objective at all. So that's another thing I'm working on is, normally these weights are just set by, I don't know, like, through A/B tests, through different product teams for business reasons. And if you look at the weights that the Twitter, that were released in the Twitter open sourcing, they look very random, like 73 here, 1, 0.5. And it's strange that those aren't studied more within computer science as well. Like how do we keep track of what the impact of those weights are that can have huge effects on the overall system? Okay, that's that on the objective. And the last thing I think I'm interested in is more control for the user. This sounds a little hypey, but like with the generative AI advances, it feels like we should be able to do some more interesting things. Like I was just having a conversation earlier, so this is why it's coming up, but like instead of just having like keyword blocking on Twitter, why can't you do something like don't show me angry content? I don't want to see it for the next day or something. I just want wholesome things, that kind of stuff.
I never thought I'd hear Smitha say, with the onset of the generative AI revolution. I think my main interest is in accountability. And so I'm at a high level just with audits on the online platform space and also in the automated decisions system space. I can see that there's like some incoming legislative movement on audits. So the Digital Services Act requires independent audits and also allows for independent sort of public interest researchers to come in and to request the information that they need to conduct audits. In the US, there's been like the Online Safety and Oversight Bill and all other sort of bills coming up where that language of audit comes up. In the automated decisions space, there's conversation of the Algorithmic Accountability Act maybe heating up and requiring audits for ADS systems. So there's definitely like legislative movement in terms of having audits as a requirement. And I see audits as a really sort of practical approach to get empirical evidence of harm and potential harm for these systems. And so I'm very down for it. But there's a lot of practical barriers that I think I hope I don't have to work for too long on it, but I think that I'm going to be working for a while to move forward. So one is just methodology. I don't think the field is very mature yet. Like I mentioned, it's this very multidisciplinary space. And so, facilitating interdisciplinary conversations to address like methodological issues that everybody's facing, working together to build tools and infrastructure. I think that's something that we're going to be working on for a very long time. Like Laura mentioned, there's not that many papers yet. We can kind of build the field and work together and talk more to make sure that we can think through, experimental, quasi-experimental methodology beyond just sort of the more observational-based studies that we're relying on right now. So there's a lot that can happen methodologically in terms of methodological development on auditing in general as a strategy for accountability, and I think that's something that I'm very interested in. I think the second thing that I'm very interested in is the connection between sort of the audit outcome and actual accountability. So like Daphne mentioned, so you can have like lawful, it's awful but not lawful. I forgot what phrase you mentioned. I will read that article. But it's like a lot of, polarization is feels bad. Radicalization is bad, and it has this reputational cost when you analyze these systems. You have empirical evidence of this phenomenon, and it comes out in the press. It looks bad for the companies, and sometimes they do take voluntary action in response to that evidence. But it's typically voluntary action. There's nothing that's illegal about promoting, misinformation or even hate speech in some. To some degree in the US, right? So Gonzalez versus Google, which was mentioned on the last panel, like the only reason that made its way to the Supreme Court was because it was connected to the Anti-Terrorism Act. So there's very few sort of like legal levers available to take an audit result, take evidence of a bad thing happening on an online platform, and translate that into a material sort of like legal consequence for the companies. Another really sort of successful example, I would say, of like actual accountability in response to audit work was Facebook's. So Facebook allowed advertisers to discriminate in terms of who they showed ads to. So for housing and job ads, you can see how that could interfere with their obligations under civil rights law. So there's a lot of that opportunity of like, okay, there's anti-discrimination law, and we have a bunch of bias audits that we could do on these platforms. And so I'm thinking a little bit about that connection between how do we design audits that are connected to like material legal accountability outcomes that lead to real consequences for these companies? I think the reputational cost lever and the advocacy lever is equally strong, but I'm very curious about what would happen if we took it all the way and we were able to really confront these companies about the harms that they were doing and focus on some of these issues that are already sort of legally questionable. So that's another sort of dimension of the work I'm hoping to do in the next couple years.
That sounds cool.
Yeah.
And I think looking at the time, I think this is when I'm supposed to tell you that if you would like to, if you have questions for this panel, I can't entirely dominate them with my questions. So if you have questions, there are some mics you can step on up. I am going to be asking some questions from the chat, but since we do have someone at the microphone here, why don't we go to Daphne Keller for a moment?
Awesome, thank you. My question is about the relative role of humans and machines in a lot of platform operations with a specific focus on implicit bias. So for people who've taken implicit bias tests, it shows that basically when you click really fast in response to an image, you are likely to make choices that reflect major societal biases. And I think in many cases, if you slowed down, you would not make those mistakes. You would bring other parts of your brain to bear. And this is relevant to platforms because at least two big players in the system are clicking really fast with their lizard brains. One is content moderators, presumably, who have to respond very quickly to it in assessing user content. And another is users. When we click very fast to like things or we inadvertently slow down in our doom scrolling or whatever it is. And so, and both of those, they're just so similar to literally the test conditions of implicit bias tests. And this is relevant, I can think of two very concrete places it's relevant. One is if you have algorithms making decisions about content and then you want the humans to double check to make sure the algorithms didn't make mistakes, you introduce that implicit bias risk, I would think. And the other, I forgot the other one. That's annoying. Anyhow, there's another one, just as good. Oh, no, I know. It's if you are relying on user behavior to show people what they appear to want based on the choices they made very rapidly, but actually if they made those choices more slowly and carefully, they would want something else. Like, is that a source of information about how algorithms could or should be different? So I'm wondering, like, is there research on that? Are there possibilities for better research on that?
I think let's start by going to William. Who I think has done the most work that's adjacent to this, and then I'm curious what other folks think.
So, is there research on that? I'm going to interpret that to mean the first part of your question, which is, how does bias creep into machine learning models, inputs and outputs? There's definitely been a lot of work on this in psychology and other fields, in computer science as well. I think we have to be careful, for example, for inputs of machine learning models. Anytime you are, for example, doing supervised learning where you're having data that's labeled often by humans,
You know, both in the instructions you're giving them to label some concepts, you can have bias creep in there based on stereotypes, for example. And then also, just like you said, when people are actually doing the labeling, you know, biases also creep in there. And of course, that will feed into the model and affect its output. So I think that's a major source of bias, and there's plenty of research on that suggesting that, you know, general stereotypes that we have in society actually creep into all of that process. So that's one thing. I guess, well, I'll stop there and see if anyone else has.
I can say something. Yeah, I remember like Mark Zuckerberg once posted this graph on his Facebook that probably a lot of people saw, you know, as things get close to the line, as content gets close to the line that they would ban it at, it gets more engagement. But a part of that post, he also said, even though that kind of content gets more engagement, people tell us they don't like it. So I think there are these like documented stories of this sensationalized clickbaity content goes viral, but people do say they don't want to see it, which is always an outstanding question I had. Is this content that is terrible, but people say they want to see? Because if that's the case, then we don't really have a hope of learning from behavioral feedback from people. But I think also what we saw in our study, like people actually say they don't want to see this. So I think there's hope for incorporating more of those explicit results in, and I'd like to see more research on that. I guess also when on YouTube or something where they're like, did you find this satisfying afterwards? They are trying to measure these different preferences.
And I would also just add to that, you know, there's decades of research on revealed versus stated preferences in psychology and economics. So I think a lot of that could be tapped into more. And I'm glad that people like Smitha are kind of documenting some of those differences empirically in this context. So.
Just on a personal note, I think one of the things that, you know, in reaction to this question that I think about a lot is that this is where I honestly really just want platforms to be a little bit crisper in how they talk about how their own algorithms function. Because platforms often say something like, we show people things they like. When in reality, what they do is show people things that are similar to things that they've historically engaged with or watched for a long time, which are not necessarily the same thing. And I think there's actually there's like a difference in the case of YouTube where they ask people this secondary question of, you know, did you value that? That's like, after the fact, did I value that is different than, will I stare at it for a long time? Because like, I'll stare at a train wreck for a long time, but I didn't enjoy it.
Yeah, just like a quick add-on to that, there's a psychologist at UC Berkeley, Celeste Kidd, that has been looking into sort of like kid YouTube and some of the generated content on kid YouTube and how when kids sort of look at these like train wreck videos effectively of just like insane things that, you know, wild shapes, big heads, you know, Cocomelon, no offense to Cocomelon, but, you know, but just like very kind of not necessarily educational content, like it's not actually necessarily good for them. Like they pay attention to it because it's very abnormal and it's very strange, and it's not necessarily because it's enriching content or it's educating them, and so they're enraptured with interest, but because it's just sort of this like train wreck that they're staring at. So it might not be helpful for the kids' development to sort of pay attention to that for too long. So I feel like that's a great example of what you're talking about. Yeah.
And I think something else that's there, something that, you know, we all have to remember, that I think platforms need to remember, that the public needs to remember, is that, you know, so little kids are, you know, children are not tiny adults. You know, their brains are not just like scaled down versions of adult brains. Like different parts of the brain mature at different rates, and that you can't just take something that you built for adults and like this is true in drugs. You can't just like cut the dose, and you know, children's brains are they're just structurally different. And I think that this is where it gets, you know, if you're talking about products for kids and you're then talking about an algorithm that you developed for adults, to think that it will behave the same way on that different population is just like, it's not true, and representing it in that way is inaccurate. Okay, so I see we have another question asker at the podium.
Hi, I'm Megan Gray of Gray Matters, and it occurs to me that these algorithmic amplification audits are already happening. There's too much money in it. with DSA, with FTC orders, with the Facebook housing discrimination, the big 5 auditing firms are already creating these audit models. I have no doubt that that has happened. And as usually happens with these audit models, you saw it with financial audits, you saw it with cybersecurity models, or cybersecurity audits, and then privacy audits, environmental, diversity. There's a timeline, and they start fairly rudimentary, right? And they get more sophisticated and complex as things go along. And also what I've noticed with the evolution of these in other industries is that the audits are not public. And they're also, if you even get a lead on one, you have to purchase it to see what the framework is. And I'm just wondering, given the interdisciplinary aspects of this, if y'all are in conversations with those big 5 green lampshade auditors who are in fact doing this already, because they're being paid by the companies being audited, and so these are probably not models that you would approve of, but in order to influence their development, there needs to be that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, why don't we start with Deb on this one?
Yeah, I was gonna say, there's a lot of thinking that I've done with like Dan Ho, Peggy Hsu, and Colleen Heisenberg at Stanford Law on this sort of analogy to other industries. And so we have this sort of ongoing project where we look at audit schemes in other domains and try to learn lessons for, what went well and what went wrong. So in some domains that you mentioned, so finance, for example, like the SEC has the Edgar database where you could technically, there is like a publicly viewable or publicly requestable version of the audits that are done on financial institutions. And that's like, and in particular, post-Enron finance has been very meticulous about thinking about the independence of the auditor and some of these problems that we're now sort of realizing are issues in the algorithm audit space today. And so there's a lot of these industries that have tried auditing as an accountability mechanism and has succeeded to varying degrees, and that we can learn a lot from. I think there's a couple of points that you mentioned. So I think one is the sort of, you were mentioning sort of the evolution of the methodology and sort of being careful. I think maybe you were alluding to the concern of audit washing, which Ellen Goodman had sort of written about at the German and Marshall Fund, where she sort of wrote a paper called Audit Washing, where they were talking about this concern of that has arisen in finance, and it has arisen also in like food safety and other spaces, where you do an audit, but what is like sort of publicly viewable is not necessarily useful as an accountability mechanism. And so it just ends up sort of being this checkbox activity that doesn't necessarily push forward your ability to question or to push back on corporate activity. I think that that's a real possibility in this space, given the fact that the methodology is so, it's still really nascent and still really kind of chaotic. There's a lot of opportunity for various actors to just claim that they're an audit without any level of accreditation or training or independence. And so it's very possible for them to use any kind of metric that they want, and for that metric to be gamed by the platforms in various ways. Currently, the Digital Services Act requires an independent auditor to come in, which is selected by the company and paid by the company to come in and to do that audit. And I think there's a lot of speculation, like you alluded to, that one of the big 4, so like Deloitte, PwC, like those kind of traditional audit companies will come in and they'll, Deloitte and some of these companies, McKinsey, already have algorithm audit teams in preparation for the DSA, and that they just come in and they do sort of this cosmetic exercise. They generate a report that doesn't necessarily mean anything because they're just paid to sort of go through this process, and then they leave. So I think that that is a critique that I've heard, and it makes a lot of sense, but I think there's ways that we can kind of push back against it. So for one, there is the data access clause under the DSA, which allows for independent sort of public interest researchers to come in with their own questions and sort of have protected access to these systems. So they're not selected by or paid by these by the audit target. And so they have a different positioning, civil society research, like academic researchers, and they can ask a different type of question and hold these companies accountable in a different kind of way. And then the other thing I'll mention is these internal sort of audit structures that are going to play out under the audit clause for the DSA, I think the way it's going to manifest is just that we're going to see a lot more documentation about these systems. Like a lot of the companies we're talking about, Facebook, Twitter, they already have, or they did. Usually they had integrity teams. They had people, past, present, future, who knows? But like there's typically a responsible AI team or integrity team that has been doing work and has been collecting metrics about some of these questions or some of these problems. Like I mentioned earlier, there's reputational cost to not doing well on some of these things, even if there's not like legal liability. And so a lot of the information about these systems already lives on the inside. I think something like the DSA and some of the proposals, some of the bills coming through in the US, their goal is for these audits to happen, for that documentation to be sort of standardized or at least clarified in some way that you can kind of know what to expect, and then have that submittable to a regulator that then advocates can then query and like have access to later on. So it makes it a little bit more open, or it makes the path for that information to be open in a different way than if the companies were just doing it voluntarily by themselves. We don't know exactly what they're doing. They're not mandated to collect specific metrics, so we have no clue sort of the scope of what their audits are about. But also they're not giving that information to any kind of regulator, so the regulators also have no idea what they're doing. So at least now, because the regulators will have visibility, there will be a pathway for, via FOIA requests, for example, for an external party to come in and request that information. So it's a step forward, even though it's not a perfect step. And I know that there's been quite a few people thinking about the sort of potential for this to go down the route of audit washing, because that's happened in these other industries. And they've been actively sort of advocating for different clauses, like the data access clause, like some of these things I mentioned about like regulatory reporting, so making sure that the companies at least have to communicate with the regulator in ways that we can then request to see. So all of these things are things that people have actively been thinking about, given the lessons that we've learned from these other industries. So yeah, I think that's like a great point and a great perspective, but definitely something that people are reflecting on.
Does anyone else want to respond to that? I have so many questions. So many questions are also coming in from the from the online site. But one thing that several people had questions about, and something I know I myself think about a lot. So there's a lot of folks who are asking, how do we approach auditing when we're talking about systems that have very low explainability, like large language models? And but I wanted to broaden that question out a little bit for everyone, because I think we're not just talking about systems that inherently have low explainability because of sort of their structure, but also there's a lot of systems that have low explainability because platforms don't love sharing data. And while some new mechanisms are going to be opening up through the DSA, it is going to take some time for that to happen. So I do think that I think a lot about how to approach black box auditing. I know everyone else here does too, but I guess I'm curious, if you could talk a little bit about, anyone who's interested in it, how you're approaching auditing these systems where an option isn't going in and looking at the model weights, right? How do we approach those kinds of problems?
I can jump in.
Yeah.
I don't really understand how auditing an LLM is less explainable than auditing a recommender system. Like we just saw that huge diagram that Tomo showed, and there are LLMs that are probably parts of that for the embeddings and so on. So I don't see how it's different. And I think that when we're auditing, especially these systems, we're interested in like the downstream effects, not just what the model weights are. I don't even think the model weights would be that helpful. And Twitter, I think with the audits also, it's with the black box models, one trickiness is, if it's just changing day to day, what information did you learn at all? So I think it is important you have some kind of mechanistic idea of why you might be getting certain outcomes. Like for me, for example, with the recommender systems, I do think a lot of it comes from the objective function being misaligned. Like it's optimizing for behavioral outcomes. So the things we get from the audit, sure, the models might be changing, they might upgrade to a new whatever model, but it's if it's ultimately still optimizing for the same kinds of things, and we believe mechanistically that these things would lead to these kinds of outcomes, then the audit is still worthwhile at that moment in time. Yeah, those are just some thoughts I have off the cuff.
I feel like one of the challenges with online platform audits, though, is reproducibility, because it's really hard to understand what sample you're looking at when because you're just trying to get a representative sample of the user base, but typically like different studies will take a different snapshot, and then like you mentioned, sort of a different algorithm will be running at a different time, and it's really hard to figure out any level of consistency that can ensure reproducibility of these studies. So I know that that's something that as a community we have to think more about and talk more about. And there has been discussion of if companies are sharing information about their systems or are obliged to share information about their systems under law, maybe they should provide the representative sample, and that should be like a consistent data set that everybody works from, so we can have some degree of like guarantee of reproducibility. So I know that there's like practical roadblocks just because of the fact that we don't have direct access to the system or full information about the system that makes it really hard to come up with a very kind of like valid study. I will also add like, something that I find interesting was, and this is again, as part of conversations around data access and the DSA, is people kind of brought up that, it would be nice to have, information that could support in re-engineering, such as, the code, but like Smitha mentioned, that's not the most important or most interesting thing. There's a lot of information that you can get behaviorally, or you can just kind of collect based off of behaviors on the platform, or observe and collect collect through observations of interactions on the platform. But I do think there hasn't been it's really hard to do an intervention type-based study where you look. I think you Smitha, sort of thought through that when you kind of had the default baseline compared to the algorithmic, and that's like Twitter allowing users to do that. But for like YouTube, for example, it would be really hard to come up with a experimental evaluation of different algorithms on YouTube, just because we don't have control as researchers on what algorithm is running on YouTube at a given moment. So I think that that's definitely a roadblock that makes it really difficult, and opening the box or having a hand in the box would have been helpful for that purpose. I think also to the point about experiments, something that I found really interesting was there's sort of this, when we were doing the project on audit tooling, something that people were mentioning was sort of the use of simulation. Like there's the Simulacra project out of Stanford where they were sort of simulating Reddit using large language models, which seems insane, but it actually kind of was an opportunity for them to sort of test out different algorithms. I know the forensics AI, there's a group called Forensics AI or Tracking Exposed that also allows you to sort of rearrange items in the recommended panel on YouTube, and you can use that to simulate the deployment of different alternative algorithms. So there's some tools that people are coming up with to work around the fact that we don't have access to the direct system, and and it would be very difficult for them to agree to give us access. And I think that that's really pushing the whole field in the right direction of like, how far can we go? But I also feel like maybe the companies should be required to collaborate on some really important questions where experimental evaluation is really just what we need. And then I'll say the final point, which is again around data access. I think sometimes when people think data access, they say like, okay, give us the training set, or which is they're not gonna, but like give us like a representative sample, or just give us like information, something similar to what you might get from an API. But I think there's also a lot of interest, especially from sort of non-quantitative scholars that use non-quantitative methods, so like people from social science, where they want to just see like procedural documents. So they want to see, and this is how a lot of a certain amount of internal audit work happens. I remember when I worked on an internal audit project at Google, like a lot of that work was just collecting documentation from different teams throughout the company and piecing together a story of how what decisions were made by the engineers to get to a particular model. Were those the right decisions? Did that whole story make sense? Did the evaluations that were involved in this process make sense? And then reviewing that documentation as a form of audit. So I think this kind of procedural audit and collecting information around that is something that's under considered as a valid form of investigating what's actually happening with these systems. And that information could be useful to have as well.